You know, we think of pirates as these fearsome creatures of the sea, right? Masters of their domain, conquering merchant vessels, terrorizing the Spanish Main. But here's something most people never consider. These guys were absolutely miserable. I mean, truly, unbearably miserable in ways that would make most of us quit after about 3 days. Picture this. It's the Caribbean summer of 1718. Now, I want you to really understand what that means. We're not talking about a pleasant beach vacation. We're talking about a floating prison of heat that could literally kill you just as effectively as any sword or musket ball. And leading one of these floating furnaces was Captain Jonathan Thornbury. They called him Black Jack. Thornbury commanding a vessel called the Serpent's Revenge, 40 guns, a proper warship by any standard. This wasn't some dingy little sloop. This was a brigantine that could go toe-to-toe with naval vessels and come out on top. But here's the thing that gets me, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. Thornbury had become a prisoner of his own success. Think about that for a second. He'd captured enough treasure to buy himself a plantation, to retire, to live like a gentleman. His personal cabin, his great cabin as they called it, had these Venetian glass windows, each one worth 800 pieces of 8. That's serious money. We're talking about the kind of decorative elements you'd find in a governor's mansion. And these windows turned his quarters into an absolute oven. The irony is just delicious, isn't it? The lowliest member of his crew, the guy swabbing the decks, could at least find some shade beneath the canvas sails. He could catch a breeze. But the captain? The man who commanded everything and everyone? He sat in his ornate cabin watching candle wax literally pool into puddles on his mahogany desk. His precious navigation charts, the ones that represented years of accumulated knowledge, routes, safe, harbours, Spanish patrol patterns, they were yellowing and cracking from the heat. His fortune was cooking him alive. Into this situation walked a young man named Timothy Hawkins. Tim was 22 years old, son of a master carpenter from Portsmouth's naval yards. Now, Portsmouth, that's one of England's premier naval centres. This wasn't some random guy who knew how to hammer nails. Tim came from shipbuilding royalty, in a sense. His father worked on Royal Navy vessels, real ships of the line, and Tim ended up on a pirate ship through one of those brutal twists of fate that defined the age. He'd been pressed into service, which is just a polite way of saying kidnapped when pirates took the merchant vessel Pride of Bristol somewhere near Barbados. One day you're a legitimate sailor on a merchant run, the next day you're a pirate, whether you want to be or not. That was the reality. But here's where Tim's story gets interesting, and why he's not just another forgotten name in maritime history. His grandfather had sailed with Francis Drake. Just let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about a direct connection to the glory days of English privateering, and that grandfather brought back tales, stories that most people would dismiss as sailors' yarns. But Tim paid attention. These were stories about Arab ships operating in the Arabian Gulf, ships that somehow stayed cool even when the temperature outside would cook you like an egg on the deck. His mother, Sarah Hawkins, worked in the sail lofts back in Portsmouth, and if you know anything about sail lofts, you know they were places where old sailors congregated. These guys would share stories for a cup of rum, tales of Persian towers, these architectural marvels called wind catchers that could grab breezes and funnel them into buildings, stories about Chinese ships with mysterious breathing holes that circulated air in ways European vessels never did. Tim absorbed all of this. He was learning his father's trade, understanding how ships were built from the keel up, but he was also collecting this library of knowledge in his head. Knowledge about cooling, about air circulation, about principles that most European shipwrights had never even considered, and he never imagined he'd actually need any of it. Until March 1718, during a vicious boarding action against a Dutch merchantman called the Vrolijke Hendrik. Now, boarding actions were absolute chaos, men fighting hand-to-hand in confined spaces, smoke everywhere, the noise deafening. In the middle of all this mayhem, Tim was doing his job hauling plunder up from below decks, and he saw something, a glint of metal where it shouldn't be. A hidden Spanish assassin, this guy had been paid 5,000 pieces of 8 to eliminate Thornbury. 5,000 pieces of 8. That's enough money to live comfortably for years. This wasn't some random act. This was a professional hit. The killer emerged from the cargo, hold, blade in hand, lunging for the captain. Tim shouted a warning, just managed to get it out in time. Thornbury's pistol ball found its mark, and the assassin went down. In that moment, in the aftermath of nearly being murdered, with the adrenaline still pumping, Tim made what most people would call an absolutely insane proposal. He told the captain he could make his quarters comfortable. Actually comfortable, cool, livable. And he'd do it by the Feast of St. James in July. That gave him barely 4 months. The stakes? If he succeeded, he'd earn his freedom plus a 2% share of all future prizes taken by the ship. If he failed, a slow dance at the end of a rope. Hanging. Public execution as an example to anyone else who might waste the captain's time with impossible promises. The quartermaster, William Pearson, they called him Bloody Bill, and with good reason laughed until tears streamed down his face. The ship's traditional carpenter, this elderly guy named Marcus, Findlay, spat tobacco juice and declared Tim completely mad. These were experienced sailors, men who'd spent decades at sea. They knew it was impossible. Ships were hot. That was just reality. You learned to live with it, or you died. But Thornbury was desperate and intrigued. Maybe he saw something in Tim's eyes. Maybe the heat had finally worn him down to the point where any possibility seemed worth exploring. He accepted the bargain. That night, Tim opened a journal. This wasn't just any journal. It had been taken from a Moorish navigator named Ahmed ibn Rashid 3 raids back, written in Arabic script. Most of the pirates probably couldn't even identify the language, much less read it. But Tim had convinced a captured Jewish merchant to translate sections of it, and within those pages were diagrams, detailed technical drawings of something called bad gear, wind catchers, the same wind catchers from those old stories his mother had shared. These devices had been adapted for ships by Persian traders 5 centuries earlier. 5 centuries? This wasn't some theoretical concept. This was proven technology that had been working for generations. It just hadn't made it to European vessels because, well, Europeans didn't tend to learn from other cultures' engineering back then. Pride, arrogance, call it what you want. Tim had the knowledge. He had the motivation, survive or die, and he had 4 months to build something that had never existed on a Caribbean pirate ship. Something that would either save his life or guarantee his death. The clock was ticking. So Tim has made this deal, right? And now he's got to actually deliver. 4 months to do something that's never been done. And where do you even start with a project like this? Well, if you're Tim Hawkins, you start by turning yourself into the world's most obsessive scavenger. His workshop became the ship's orlop deck, that's the lowest full deck on the vessel, right down near the waterline. Dark, cramped, but it gave him space away from prying eyes, and he started hoarding materials like a magpie collecting shiny objects for a nest. Now, here's where piracy actually becomes useful for once. Every ship they captured became a potential hardware store, and these weren't just any ships, we're talking about vessels carrying cargo from all over the world. The global trade network of the 18th century delivered right to Tim's doorstep through violence and theft. The irony doesn't escape me. From the Portuguese warship Nossa Senhora das Dores, that translates to Our Lady of Sorrows, which is fitting, Tim salvaged 12 fathoms of copper piping. 12 fathoms. That's 72 feet of copper pipe. And this wasn't just any copper. This was high-quality stuff, intended for the governor's mansion in Rio de Janeiro. Some Portuguese official was probably having a very bad day when he found out his expensive plumbing materials had been stolen by English pirates. The Spanish galleon, Santa Isabella, yielded brass fittings and valves. Now, brass doesn't rust like iron does in salt water. That's crucial. These fittings were worth their weight in silver, literally. The Spanish used them for the same reason Tim needed them: reliability in a marine environment. Dutch merchants, God bless them, unknowingly donated cedar panels and these cleverly hinged louvers. Cedar resists rot, resists insects. perfect for ventilation work. Each captured vessel added pieces to Tim's mechanical puzzle. And I want you to understand something about this. Tim wasn't just grabbing random parts and hoping they'd work together. He was building a mental inventory, understanding what he had, what he needed, and how it would all fit into a system that existed only in his head and in those translated diagrams from Ahmed ibn Rashid's journal. Then he got his first assistant, and this is one of those unexpected moments that changes everything. Chang Wei, a Macanese navigator taken from an East India Company prize. Now, Macau was this incredible melting pot where Portuguese, Chinese, and other Asian cultures collided. Chang Wei understood something that most European sailors didn't have the faintest clue about: the feng shui of moving air. I know. When we hear feng shui today, we think of interior decorating and crystal placements. But the original principles, they were actually rooted in genuine observation of how air and water move through spaces. Chang Wei had knowledge of bamboo ventilation systems used in the summer palaces of Guangzhou. These were systems that had been refined over centuries to deal with subtropical heat and humidity that made the Caribbean look mild by comparison. So now, you've got this incredible collaboration. An English carpenter with knowledge of Persian wind catchers, working with a Macanese navigator who understood Chinese principles of air circulation on a pirate ship. In 1718, history gets weird sometimes. Doesn't it? Construction began in April, and Tim had to be clever about it. He couldn't have the whole crew watching his every move. Pirates aren't exactly famous for respecting intellectual property. If word got out too early about what he was building, every ship in the Caribbean would have spies trying to steal the plans. So he hung canvas sheets around his workspace and told everyone it was to prevent sawdust from contaminating the gunpowder stores. Brilliant excuse, right? Nobody wants to be the guy who accidentally blows up the ship because sawdust got into the powder magazine. So people stayed away. The first innovation involved cutting channels through the ship's own structure. Think about what that means for a second. The hull of a ship isn't just wood. It's the carefully engineered bones that keep you from sinking. It provides structural integrity, and Tim was cutting into it. Narrow passages between the hull timbers that would draw cool air from below the waterline. Because, here's something most people don't realize. Even in the Caribbean in summer, once you get down below the waterline, the ocean maintains a pretty constant temperature, around 68 degrees. That's cold compared to the 100+ degree heat on deck. Tim understood he could use that temperature differential. He just had to figure out how to move that coolness where he needed it. The copper pipes, those beautiful lengths of pipe from the Portuguese warship, Tim polished them until they gleamed. They would circulate seawater through a hidden reservoir beneath the captain's bed. Now, where did he get this idea? From Roman hypocaust systems. He'd read about them in a book stolen from a Jesuit priest's cabin during some earlier raid. The Romans, 2,000 years earlier, had figured out how to heat their bathhouses by circulating hot air under the floors. Tim was doing the same thing, but in reverse. Cool water instead of hot air. But the true genius, and this is where Tim really earned his freedom, was in the wind catchers. These triangular canvas scoops that could rotate to catch breeze from any direction. Now, on a Persian building, these things are obvious. They stick up above the roofline. Everybody knows what they are. But on a pirate ship, they had to be disguised. So Tim made them look like decorative elements bearing Thornbury's personal coat of arms, heraldic decorations. Nobody would question the captain wanting to display his symbols of authority. May 23rd, 1718, the first test, and it nearly ended in complete disaster. A squall came up. These tropical squalls appear out of nowhere in the Caribbean. One minute you've got clear skies. The next minute you're in the middle of what feels like the end of the world. Wind, rain, waves. The prototype wind catcher tore free, just ripped right off its mounting. That thing was heavy canvas, wood, metal fittings. It went spinning across the deck and nearly brained the helmsman. Came within inches of killing the guy steering the ship. Chaos. Absolute chaos. And then the water circulation started leaking. Not just a little drip. A serious leak. Water started flooding the powder magazine. The powder magazine, that's where they stored all the gunpowder for the cannons. If that gets wet, you've got a useless warship. If it gets contaminated the wrong way, you've got an explosion waiting to happen. Panic spread through the crew faster than the water. Men were shouting, running. Marcus Findlay, the old carpenter who'd called Tim mad from the beginning, he led a group demanding Tim's immediate execution. Not even a trial. Just throw him overboard or string him up right there. They believed Tim had endangered the entire ship with his ridiculous experiment. Tim and Chang Wei worked frantically to stop the breach, oakum and tar. The traditional materials for sealing leaks. Their hands were bleeding. They were working so fast. The pressure was incredible, not just the water pressure, but the pressure of knowing that every second that passed, more people were calling for their deaths. They stopped the leak. Barely. The powder magazine was saved. But Tim's project looked like it was finished. The crew was demanding blood. And then something remarkable happened. Thornbury's mistress was visiting. Marie Claire Dubois. Now, she wasn't just some random woman. She ran Nassau's most exclusive brothel. And let me tell you, running a successful business in a pirate haven required intelligence, political savvy, and connections. Marie Claire was educated. French. Sharp as a knife. She'd been in the captain's cabin during the whole crisis, and while everyone else was panicking about the leak and the wind catcher failure, she noticed something. Even with the system malfunctioning, even with water going where it shouldn't and parts falling off, the captain's cabin felt cooler, noticeably cooler, measurably cooler than any room in her establishment, and she had the best building in Nassau. Her endorsement bought Tim another month. When Marie Claire Dubois spoke, people listened. She understood comfort, she understood what wealthy clients wanted, and she was telling everyone that Tim was onto something real. But word had already gotten out. That's the problem with pirate havens. Everybody talks. Crew members spending their shore leave in taverns, drinking rum, bragging about the crazy English kid who was trying to cool down the captain's cabin. Stories spread, rumours multiply. Captain Peter Morrison, they called him Bloody Pete. And again, that's never a good sign. He commanded a ship called the Crimson Death. Morrison was Thornbury's chief rival for dominance in the Windward Passage, which was one of the most lucrative hunting grounds in the Caribbean. Spanish treasure ships coming from South America had to pass through there. Morrison sent spies, offered 1,000 pieces of 8 for the plans. 1,000! That's serious money. Enough to retire comfortably. But Tim turned it down. Or maybe Thornbury's men stopped the spies before they could even make contact. Either way, bribery failed, so Morrison arranged a parley, June 15th, at Tortuga's infamous Bucket of Blood Tavern. Now, if you know anything about Caribbean pirate havens, you know Tortuga was the Wild West of the Wild West, and the Bucket of Blood lived up to its name. More men had died in that tavern than in some naval battles. The meeting was supposed to be civilized, a conversation between captains, maybe work out some kind of sharing arrangement. But Morrison's men had other plans. They tried to kidnap Tim, just grab him in the middle of the tavern and drag him out. The ensuing brawl. This was legendary. 7 men died. 7. Including Morrison's quartermaster, which was a huge loss. The quartermaster on a pirate ship is the second in command, elected by the crew. He's the one who keeps discipline, divides the plunder. Losing him is like losing your executive officer. And here's the part that really made Tim's reputation. He killed 2 of the attackers himself. Not with a sword or a pistol, with improvised weapons from his own ventilation system. A sharpened copper pipe thrust straight through one man's throat, and a weighted brass valve crushed another guy's skull like an egg. After that night, an unspoken law spread through the pirate community. Tim Hawkins was under Thornbury's protection. Touching him meant war. And nobody wanted war with Black Jack Thornbury. Tim went back to work with a new sense of security and a deadline that was rapidly approaching. July 15th, 1718, the day of reckoning, and Mother Nature decided to make things as dramatic as possible. Dead calm, not a single breath of wind. The Caribbean sat like glass. The Serpent's Revenge was motionless, sails hanging like funeral shrouds. And I love that image because it's exactly what they looked like, death hanging over everything. The temperature reached 105 degrees by noon. Below decks, men were literally fainting at their posts. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This was dangerous. Heat exhaustion can kill you just as dead as a Spanish musket ball. And this was the day Tim chose for his grand demonstration. Think about the pressure. Think about the stakes. If the system didn't work, he was going to hang. And he picked the absolute worst conditions possible to test it. Some people might call that insane, but I think Tim understood something crucial. If it worked on a day like this, it would work on any day. Thornbury entered his cabin, skeptical and sweltering. The man was probably thinking about how he was going to word the execution order, trying to be merciful, maybe make it quick. And then he felt it. 20 degrees cooler. 20 degrees! In conditions where men were dropping from heat exhaustion, Tim had created an oasis. The wind catchers, now perfected after the May disaster, were creating their own breeze through convection currents. Hot air rises, right? Basic physics. But Tim had harnessed that principle. The hot air was being pulled up and out, and cooler air from below the waterline was being drawn in to replace it. The copper pipes were radiating coolness. If you touched them, they felt like winter, like touching ice in the middle of hell. The Persian-inspired vents, hidden behind decorative Spanish screens that Tim had salvaged from some raid or another, were circulating air in a pattern that Chang Wei described as the dragon's breath. This poetic description of airflow that moved in deliberate, controlled patterns through the space. But the transformation went way beyond just temperature. And this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Thornbury suffered from chronic headaches. The ship's surgeon, Benjamin Cross, had attributed them to evil humours, which is what doctors blamed everything on back then when they had no idea what was actually wrong. Bad air, imbalanced humours, demonic possession. Take your pick. Within days of working in the cooled cabin, Thornbury's headaches vanished, completely disappeared. Now, we can speculate about why. Maybe they were actually caused by heat stress, maybe dehydration, maybe the constant misery of living in an oven was giving him tension headaches, but whatever the cause, they were gone. And here's the really fascinating consequence. Thornbury's decision-making improved dramatically. His infamous rage-fueled decisions, the kind of impulsive, angry choices that had cost him 12,000 pieces of 8 in botched raids the previous summer, those gave way to calculated strategies. Calm, rational thinking. Think about what that means. A cooler environment literally made him a better leader, a more effective pirate captain. And other captains noticed. The cabin became a war room where allied captains would gather for meetings. Before, these meetings had been brief affairs. Everyone wanted to get in, say their piece, and get out of that suffocating heat. Now, they could actually sit down, spread out maps, discuss strategy for hours. August 1st, 1718. The formation of the Brethren of the Coast Confederation happened in that cool cabin. 5 notorious pirate captains, all agreeing to share intelligence and coordinate attacks. This was unprecedented. Pirates were independent operators, fiercely territorial. Getting them to cooperate was like herding cats. Violent, murderous cats. But Thornbury's comfortable cabin provided neutral ground, a place where they could actually think clearly and see the benefits of cooperation. The economic impact was immediate and substantial. That September, they launched coordinated raids on the Spanish treasure fleet, not just one ship attacking, hoping to get lucky. Multiple ships, working together, sharing information about patrol, patterns and convoy schedules. Each ship netted over 100,000 pieces of 8. 100,000. To put that in perspective, that's enough money to buy a large plantation, outfit multiple ships, live like a gentleman for the rest of your life and still have money left over for your children. This was transformational wealth. And it all happened because Tim Hawkins made a cabin comfortable enough for pirates to cooperate. But Tim's masterstroke, the thing that really proved his genius, came with winter's arrival. Because here's what nobody expected. The same system that cooled in summer now warmed in winter. Now, the Caribbean doesn't get cold the way England does. But November through February, especially if you're on a ship in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, it gets chilly. Men would huddle together for warmth. The damp cold would settle into your bones. And Thornbury's cabin? It was warm, comfortable, cozy even. Tim had built reversible panels, these ingenious hinged sections that could redirect airflow. Instead of drawing cool air from below and venting hot air up, the system could trap heat from a Brazilian charcoal brazier and distribute it through iron plates beneath Turkish carpets. Same basic infrastructure, completely different application. That's elegant engineering. That's understanding principles rather than just copying designs. When Commodore James Whitmore's squadron trapped the Serpent's Revenge in a November gale off Cape Hatteras, that's North Carolina, dangerous waters, Thornbury maintained perfect comfort while planning their escape. His crew was cold and miserable, but the captain was sitting in his cabin, warm and dry, looking at charts and thinking clearly. And then Tim gave him a weapon. The ventilation shafts could be filled with smoke from burning tar and sulfur. This created a choking screen, this massive cloud of black, toxic smoke that could be directed by the wind catchers. The British ships sailed into it, and their crews literally couldn't breathe. Men were coughing, eyes streaming with tears, unable to man their guns or handle the sails properly. The Serpent's Revenge slipped through the British line like a ghost. Whitmore's report to the Admiralty described infernal devices that turned the very air against us. He convinced London that pirates possessed supernatural powers. Imagine that. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force in the world, reporting back that they'd been defeated by magic. The success naturally bred imitation. Other ship's carpenters who'd observed Tim's work, maybe they'd seen bits and pieces during visits to the Serpent's Revenge, or they'd heard descriptions from crew members they attempted to recreate it. With varying success, and that's putting it mildly, the Merry Fortune installed a simplified version. It actually worked well enough that they started charging other crews for cooling services while in port. Come aboard, stay cool, only, costs you 10 pieces of 8 for the afternoon. They turned it into a business, a legitimate side income for a pirate crew. The Black Eagle's attempt ended catastrophically. Improper sealing. They didn't understand the pressure differentials, didn't account for the ship's movement in rough seas. Water flooded 3 decks. They barely made it to port before the ship sank. Several men drowned. This is what happens when you copy something without understanding the underlying principles. Tim found himself in an interesting position. He was teaching construction techniques to carefully chosen students, each one paying 500 pieces of 8 for the privilege. But, and this is crucial, he never revealed the complete system to anyone, not even Chang Wei, his closest collaborator. Each student got pieces of the puzzle, enough to build something functional, but never enough to replicate Tim's full genius. Some people might call that paranoid. I call it smart. His knowledge was his currency, his life insurance. As long as he was the only one who understood the complete system, he had value. He had protection, and in the world of Caribbean piracy in 1718, protection was worth more than gold. The ventilation system had transformed Tim from a pressed sailor with a death sentence hanging over his head into the most valuable non-combatant in the Caribbean. Ship captains who wouldn't normally give a carpenter a second glance were offering him fortunes. His 2% share of the Serpent's Revenge's prizes was making him wealthy. His teaching fees were adding up. But Tim was starting to think bigger, because he'd realized something that would change his life forever. This technology had applications far beyond pirate ships. Every building in the Caribbean suffered from the same heat that had tortured Thornbury. Every plantation house, every government building, every church. They were all ovens, and Tim held the secret to cooling them. The question was, how does a pirate's carpenter become a legitimate businessman? How do you go from being an outlaw to being respectable? In 1720, Tim was about to find out, but that's a story that would take him places he never imagined and create a legacy that would last long after the age of piracy had ended. So, how does a pirate become respectable? How do you wash away the stain of years spent on the wrong side of the law? Well, in Tim's case, it started with a very uncomfortable colonial governor, 1720. Colonial Governor Nicholas Lars of Jamaica was suffering through his third tropical summer. And let me tell you something about colonial governors. These were powerful men. Representatives of the crown, they lived in the finest houses, had servants, enjoyed every luxury the colonial system could provide. But none of that made the heat bearable. Lars was miserable, absolutely miserable, and he'd heard rumours. Stories about a pirate ship where the captain lived in perfect comfort while everyone else suffered. Stories about miraculous cooling systems. Now, normally a governor wouldn't give pirate gossip the time of day, but when you're desperate, when you're lying awake at night, sweating through your sheets in your official residence, you start paying attention to any possible solution. Lars secretly negotiated Tim's pardon. Think about what that required. This is the government making a deal with someone who'd been part of criminal enterprises. But Lars wanted what Tim had, and he was willing to trade royal clemency for it. The deal was simple. Tim would install ventilation systems in Government House, and in exchange, all past crimes would be forgiven. A clean slate. The success was immediate and total. Within 2 weeks of installation, Government House became the most comfortable building in Jamaica. Lars invited other officials to visit, showed off his new cooling system like it was the 8th wonder of the world. And you know what? For the Caribbean in 1720, it basically was. Word spread fast. Plantation owners came calling. These were the wealthy elite of colonial society, men who owned thousands of acres, hundreds of slaves, who shipped sugar and rum back to England and lived like aristocrats. They wanted Tim's systems in their manor houses, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it. Tim's company registered officially as Caribbean Comfort Innovations, which I think is a brilliant name, started employing former pirates as installers. This is the part that really gets me. Tim was giving legitimate work to men who otherwise had no options except to keep pirating or face the gallows. And the work paid better than plunder. Much better. More reliable too. No risk of being shot or hanged. By 1725, Tim's accumulated wealth exceeded £200,000 sterling. £200,000. That's more money than most pirates saw in their entire lifetimes. More money than successful merchant captains accumulated over decades of legitimate trade. And Tim did it by making people comfortable. But let's talk about Captain Thornbury, because his end is important to this story. He met his fate in 1721, not in some glorious naval battle, not in a duel with a Spanish captain, a fever outbreak. These epidemics swept through ships periodically, killing indiscriminately. 30 crew members died in 4 days. 4 days! That's the reality of 18th century maritime life. Disease was a bigger killer than combat. Thornbury died peacefully in his perfectly climate-controlled cabin. According to witnesses, his last words were, "At least I'm comfortable." There's something both tragic and perfect about that, isn't there? This fearsome pirate captain, terror of the Spanish Main, and at the end he's grateful just to be cool. The Serpent's Revenge was scuttled by her surviving crew off Ocracoke Island. They couldn't maintain the ship with so many dead, couldn't man her properly, so they sank her in shallow water rather than let her fall into enemy hands. And here's the remarkable part. The cabin's ventilation system, built to last, continued functioning underwater for years. Pearl divers reported strange currents around the wreck, consistent patterns of water movement that didn't match natural currents. The wind catchers, even submerged, were still trying to move air, or in this case, water. Tim had built something so robust, so well engineered, that it continued operating in conditions it was never designed for. The Royal Navy's adoption of Tim's principles came through subterfuge and necessity. Admiral George Rodney, commanding the Jamaica station, suffered heat exhaustion during the summer of 1748. This is decades after Tim's original invention, but the technology still hadn't been officially adopted by the Navy. Too much pride, too much not invented here syndrome. Rodney's flagship carpenter was Thomas Worthington, secretly one of Tim's former students. One of those guys who'd paid 500 pieces of 8 to learn the techniques. Worthington installed what he called a modified Dutch cooling system. The Dutch were known for innovative shipbuilding, so this gave the design a veneer of European respectability. But it was pure Tim Hawkins innovation. Every principle, every technique came from those original designs. The improvement in crew health and performance was so dramatic that the Admiralty couldn't ignore it. Ships with the cooling systems had lower mortality rates. Sailors could work longer in tropical conditions. Officers made better decisions. The advantages were undeniable. So the Admiralty commissioned widespread implementation, standardizing it as the Rodney Ventilation Protocol. Rodney got the credit. His name is on the system. Naval historians estimate this innovation saved 8,000 lives from heat-related illness over the next century. 8,000 sailors who would have died from heat exhaustion, who survived because of ventilation principles developed by a pressed carpenter on a pirate ship, and hardly anyone knew Tim's name. Tim himself vanished from official records after 1730, just disappeared. And this has driven historians crazy for generations. We have documentation of his company. We have records of installations. We have contracts and payment receipts. And then nothing. He's gone. The rumours persisted for decades, though. Some claimed he lived in Charleston under the name Thomas Newcomb, designing houses with remarkable airflow. Charleston had these beautiful houses with high ceilings and carefully positioned windows. Some architectural historians believe Tim influenced that development. Others swore they'd seen him in Havana, consulting for Spanish admirals. The Spanish, who'd lost so much to pirates, hiring one of the men who'd helped those pirates be more effective. The irony would be delicious. A persistent legend placed him in India, teaching Maratha shipbuilders how to combat coastal heat. The Marathas were building a navy in the 18th century, trying to compete with European powers. Tim's knowledge would have been incredibly valuable there. The most credible account comes from a 1753 letter where Benjamin Franklin describes meeting an elderly English architect in Philadelphia whose ventilation theories preceded modern understanding by generations. Franklin was fascinated by air circulation, by heat transfer, by practical applications of scientific principles. If he met Tim, he would have recognized the genius. But there's a dark side to this legacy that we need to talk about. Because history isn't simple. Innovation isn't always used for good purposes. Slave ships adopted modified versions of Tim's system. They reduced mortality rates during the Middle Passage from 40% to 25%. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a humanitarian improvement. Fewer people dying, right? But the actual result? It enabled greater human trafficking. Ship captains could pack more enslaved people into holds because they could keep them alive longer. The efficiency of the slave trade increased. More human beings were torn from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic because Tim's ventilation made it economically viable. Sugar plantations using his designs increased productivity by keeping workers functional in extreme heat. Workers who were slaves. People who had no choice. The comfort Tim created for wealthy plantation owners came at the cost of enabling them to extract more labor from enslaved people. Did Tim know this would happen? Did he consider these implications when he sold his systems to plantation owners? We have no record of his thoughts. No letters expressing regret or justification. Nothing. If he lived to see these applications of his work, he left no evidence of how he felt about it. This is the uncomfortable reality of technological innovation. You can't always control how your inventions are used. Once something is out in the world, it takes on a life of its own. The same principles that made a pirate captain comfortable enabled the slave trade to become more efficient. That's the truth, and we can't shy away from it. Modern marine archaeologists studying the Serpent's Revenge wreck in 1987, that's over 260 years after it sank, marveled at the sophisticated engineering. They brought up pieces of the ventilation system, studied the copper pipes, the valve mechanisms, the wind catcher mounting points. Computer modeling showed the system's efficiency exceeded modern passive cooling by 15%. 15%. Engineers in the 1980s, with all their advanced knowledge and computer-aided design, couldn't improve on what Tim built by hand in 1718. That tells you something about the quality of his work. Patent applications citing Thornbury-Hawkins principles still appear annually. Engineers and designers are still building on his foundation. The International Maritime Museum in Hamburg displays a recreation that draws 40,000 visitors yearly. People from all over the world come to see how an 18th-century carpenter revolutionized climate control. The boy from Portsmouth who stole comfort from the heavens, I love that phrase, because that's essentially what Tim did. He took principles that had existed for centuries in other cultures, adapted them in ways nobody had thought of, and gave humanity its first real victory over environmental extremes, not through brute force, not through massive energy expenditure, but through clever engineering and understanding of natural principles. This revolution was born in desperation. A young man facing execution found a way to survive. And in surviving, he changed how humans inhabit hostile environments. Ships became more livable, buildings became more comfortable, thousands of lives were saved, and yes, terrible things were enabled too. That's the complexity of history. Tim Hawkins probably never imagined the full scope of what he'd started. He just wanted to live. He wanted to earn his freedom. He wanted to turn his grandfather's stories and his mother's tavern gossip into something real, and he succeeded beyond anything he could have dreamed. We don't know where he ended his days. We don't know if he died rich or poor, famous or forgotten, but his legacy surrounds us. Every time you adjust an air vent, every time you feel cool air moving through a building on a hot day, you're experiencing echoes of Tim's innovation. The pirate who never wanted to be a pirate, the carpenter who became an engineer, the prisoner who bought his freedom with ingenuity. And that, I think, is a pretty remarkable story.